All right, everybody, we'll go ahead and get started here. Thank you for joining us tonight to talk about Yellowstone cutthroat trout. This is part of our human and wildlife interaction speaker series. And so this has been going on since June. We've had people talk about the history of conservation in Park County. We've also talked about elephants and tigers. And the idea being that by learning about how humans and wildlife interact throughout the world, and throughout history as well, we can have a better understanding of what goes on in our own backyard, the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, seeing as there are a lot of human and wildlife interactions here. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Jason, and you can go ahead and introduce yourself.
Hello, good evening, everyone. My name is Jason Burckhardt. I'm a fisheries biologist with the Wyoming Game and Fish Department. I've been in this position for 18 years now, and much of that time has been spent in the Greybull River drainage, where I've been studying Yellowstone cutthroat trout. So I'm going to go ahead and get this kicked off. I'm going to share my screen if it's showing up for everyone.
Yeah, we've got it.
Okay, very good. I guess I would lead off by saying I was really hopeful that this was going to be an in-person presentation. I do understand the pandemic that we're in, and it's just these kind of interactions are best done, I think, in person, but we'll do our best with this through Zoom. So tonight I'm going to talk a little bit about the conservation and management of native Yellowstone cutthroat trout in the Greybull River drainage. Just to outline my talk a little bit, I want to introduce everyone to the Greybull River drainage. It is a somewhat unique system. Then I'll do an introduction of Yellowstone cutthroat trout to let our watchers understand what those fishes are. Then I'll outline some conservation efforts and activities that have been done by the Wyoming Game and Fish Department and numerous other partners. I have to say that this is these efforts to conserve Yellowstone cutthroat trout extend to have been conducted by a number of people, not just the Game and Fish Department. We've got a lot of help from landowners within the drainage, as well as entities like Trout Unlimited, and those can't thank those folks enough for the great work that they do to help conserve our native fish. And at the end of that, I'll provide an opportunity for individuals to ask questions. So the Greybull River drainage is the third largest tribute. The Greybull River itself is the third largest tributary to the Bighorn River. From its headwaters, it flows approximately 94 miles to the confluence of the Bighorn River near Greybull, Wyoming. The total drainage area is about 1,120 square miles. There's some pretty dramatic changes in the landscape over that distance. Elevations within the basin range from 13,153 feet at the top of Frank's Peak down to just over 3,800 feet at the Greybull River's confluence with the Bighorn River. The headwaters of the Greybull River begin in the Burckhardt mountain range in northwestern Wyoming. Geologically, this area was formed by volcanic activity about 30 to 50 million years ago. I'm going to be talking mostly about this the river within the Burckhardt mountain range, because that's where we find our Yellowstone cutthroat trout by and large. This area contains very porous rock and highly erodible soils. The tributaries within the Greybull are characterized by torrential high elevation mountain streams. They've got fairly steep channel slopes and very unstable substrates. There's large fluctuations in discharge from spring to late summer. And I guess kind of the take-home message is that the Greybull River drainage is not what you might consider ideal trout habitat. But the fish that we have there are actually doing quite well. Those are our Yellowstone cutthroat trout. So a cutthroat trout, the name cutthroat is kind of an oddity for a fish, for especially those folks that have never encountered a cutthroat trout. The name cutthroat was coined by Charles Halleck, who was an editor of Forest and Stream magazine back in 1884. And actually, the name cutthroat was kind of a, it wasn't well received amongst the ichthyologists that were studying the fish at the time. But it is a pretty good name for one of the distinguishing characteristics of that fish, and that's that bright orange or red slash that you'll find underneath the jaw. So the name, which was coined back in 1884, has stuck, and cutthroat it is. The scientific name for cutthroat is Oncorhynchus clarkii, and I could go into the details of why it is, how those names came about, but we can save that for a later discussion. But amongst cutthroat trout, there's really a lot of diversity. There were 14 different subspecies of cutthroat trout across the Intermountain West. And 2 of those subspecies of cutthroat have already been, have gone extinct. The cutthroat that we're talking about tonight are those that you see that occupy that green blob in northwestern Wyoming, south central Montana, southeast Idaho, and then a small portion of Nevada and Utah. And those are our Yellowstone cutthroat trout. The Yellowstone cutthroat trout, historically, this is a map that was generated by the Yellowstone Cutthroat Trout Conservation Team. We got together and all of the state and federal managers of these fish got together and tried to determine where we had cutthroat trout. This is the distribution of Yellowstone cutthroat trout prior to European settlement. This is our the best information we have related to where we had Yellowstone cutthroat trout about 200 years ago. And the Yellowstone cutthroat trout occupied both sides of the Continental Divide. So they occupied the Snake River drainage upstream from Shoshone Falls in south central Idaho. And they occupied the Yellowstone River drainage down to and including the Tongue River drainage east of the Continental Divide. Now, the Yellowstone cutthroat trout were present west of the Continental Divide up until about the last glacial period, when the ice sheet started to recede on the Yellowstone Plateau. A pathway for cutthroat trout to proceed from west of the divide to east of the divide was opened up. And actually that pathway still exists today. There's a stream that's just outside of the southeastern corner of Yellowstone National Park called North Two Ocean Creek. North Two Ocean Creek flows down the mountain and splits, with a portion of the water going to into Pacific Creek and eventually to the Pacific Ocean, and a portion of the water going down Atlantic Creek into the Yellowstone River, Missouri River, and eventually to the Atlantic Ocean. So that pathway for fish to get from one side of the Continental Divide to the other side of the Continental Divide still exists. So when those ice sheets receded about 8,000 to 10,000 years ago, Yellowstone cutthroat trout they proceeded down the Yellowstone River and occupied all of those tributaries down to and including the Tongue River drainage, as I mentioned. Now, not all has been well for Yellowstone cutthroat trout. And if you take a look at, this is the current distribution in the blue line still. The red are places in which we have Yellowstone cutthroat trout that are no longer present. And then the purple are places where we still have some Yellowstone cutthroat trout, but they're not really of conservation value. And I'll go into that in a little bit of, in more detail on a upcoming slide. So what are some of the reasons for Yellowstone cutthroat trout declines? Well, with westward expansion, Yellowstone cutthroat trout were feeding settlers that were coming into this part of the country. There are stories of individuals that would fish and feed many of the soldiers that were at an encampment on the northern slope of the Bighorns. And just a few anglers were able to harvest so many, enough fish to feed those soldiers that were over there in the Little Bighorn River drainage, or in the Little Bighorn and Tongue River drainages. So overharvest was certainly implicated in some of the historic declines of Yellowstone cutthroat populations. Habitat degradation have also been implicated in Yellowstone cutthroat declines. We have mining activities that have reduced water quality to the point where they were no longer suitable for Yellowstone cutthroat trout. The logging activities, including the tie drives of the turn of the last century, really altered much of the habitat that was occupied by Yellowstone cutthroat trout. Now, the logging may not have extirpated populations necessarily, but they certainly altered the habitat to reduce the carrying capacity of those streams. Water development has fragmented Yellowstone cutthroat trout populations, and in some cases that has led to the extirpation or the local extinction of some of those populations. And grazing. Now again, grazing, poor grazing practices may not have led to the extirpation of populations, but it has certainly in some places reduced the habitat quality to the point where many of those populations are dramatically reduced from their historic levels. But really, one of the largest nails in the coffin of Yellowstone cutthroat trout are the presence of non-native trout. Now, our proximity to Yellowstone National Park, probably many folks are familiar with the plight of Yellowstone cutthroat trout in Yellowstone Lake due to the illegal introduction and presence of lake trout, which have preyed very heavily on those Yellowstone cutthroat Yellowstone cutthroat population and caused some pretty dramatic declines. But you know, lake trout are not the only problem. We have many places, brook trout, where they have been introduced, have led to the local extinction of Yellowstone cutthroat populations. Brown trout are probably a little less impactful to Yellowstone cutthroat trout, but they certainly do displace Yellowstone cutthroat trout and prey on them as well. And that photo on the bottom is actually a picture of a rainbow cutthroat hybrid. Rainbow trout are one of the most detrimental introduced species into Yellowstone cutthroat trout waters because they're close cousins and readily hybridize with the Yellowstone cutthroat. So really the presence of these non-native trout, they're actually the greatest threat to the long-term persistence of of Yellowstone cutthroat trout where we currently have them. And the long-term persistence of Yellowstone cutthroat trout is questionable anytime we have these non-natives present. So if I go back to that map that I showed you earlier, that had a lot of the blue where we still have conservation populations, you can see if you overlay the locations where we have non-native trout on those populations now in that kind of mustard yellow color on the screen. Those are all the places where we have non-native trout. The number of places that we have Yellowstone cutthroat trout that are that exist without non-native trout are actually quite rare. And because of the plight of these fish, in the late 90s and in 1998, Yellowstone cutthroat trout were petitioned for listing under the Endangered Species Act. Now, in 2006, the Fish and Wildlife Service determined that listing was not warranted, but the petitioners filed an intent to appeal, which essentially just means that the book hasn't entirely been closed on that listing decision. So while there has been no action since that 2006 appeal, there is always that potential that listing could come back. Now, I wanted to bring you back to this map as well. Because of the broad geographic distribution of Yellowstone cutthroat trout, we actually manage these based upon their major drainages. And there are really three of those. You have the Wind and Bighorn River drainage in the red polygon that's there. The Yellowstone River drainage that's in the blue polygon, and then the Snake River drainage, which is in the green polygon. And if you look at both the Yellowstone and Snake River drainages, you actually see a fair amount of blue, meaning that we have Yellowstone cutthroat populations of conservation value that occupy quite a bit of habitat in those major drainages. But if you take a look a little closer at the Wind and Bighorn River drainage, that geographic management unit, if you will, you'll see that we don't have a whole lot of blue left. And the one place that we do have a good population, a lot of blue, is the Greybull River drainage. And that's very important because the Greybull River drainage is really within the Wind and Bighorn geographic management unit is about as good as it gets. So so those of you that live in the Greybull River drainage should be grateful that you still have those native trout that are there. So when the Yellowstone cutthroat trout were petitioned for listing, the state and federal entities that are involved with management of those of the animals and the landscapes on which they live got together and formed the Yellowstone cutthroat trout conservation team. And that includes Fish and Wildlife agencies from the states of Wyoming, Montana, Idaho, as well as Nevada and Utah. It includes the Forest Service, the BLM, the tribes that are involved in that have management or Yellowstone cutthroat trout on their tribal lands, and it includes some of the other individuals and entities that are interested in conserving these fish. And these state and federal agencies got together and put together an agreement for Yellowstone cutthroat trout. And the goal of that agreement is to ensure the long-term persistence of Yellowstone cutthroat trout throughout its broad historical range. So we really want to maintain these fish across the areas in which they historically occupied. Areas that are currently occupied by Yellowstone cutthroat trout will be maintained, and while other areas will be managed for an increased abundance and connectivity. And where possible, new populations will be established. We're going to manage these populations to preserve the genetic integrity and provide for adequate numbers and populations for protection of the maintenance of both intrinsic values and recreational values. So we want to have fishable populations out there on the landscape. And so this is the goal of those of us that are trying to manage Yellowstone cutthroat trout. Our friends at Trout Unlimited, they've come up with kind of this, their goals are to protect, reconnect, and restore populations, or restore habitats. And I think that sums up pretty well those kind of activities that we're trying to do in the Greybull to improve conditions for Yellowstone cutthroat trout. So we're trying to, as it relates to protecting, we're trying to protect the habitat. Now in the beginning in the late 1990s, the Wyoming Game and Fish Department moved forward with filing for in-stream flow water rights for streams that are above existing users. These are, I guess I should back up. In talking about the Greybull River drainage, the water of the Greybull is intensively used for irrigation agriculture. And so most of the, actually all of the water in the Greybull is allocated. So it's one of the issues related to Yellowstone cutthroat trout is maintaining water, having enough water to provide habitat for those animals. And beginning in the 1990s, the Wyoming Game and Fish Department began collecting data to file for in-stream flow water rights. Now, these water rights are junior to irrigators that are downstream. Most of these water rights exist on, I believe all of them in this drainage exist on public lands. And like I said, they are above the current water users. So really what these in-stream flow water rights do is prevent additional development, reservoir development or those types of things in many of those headwater areas that are occupied by Yellowstone cutthroat trout. One thing these water rights do is ensure that downstream water users do have their, those water needs will be met. Protecting water where we still have strong populations of cutthroat was very important. And we have those filings on all major tributaries. This is a screenshot from the Wyoming Water and Climate Web Atlas that was on the that I reached through the Water Development website. Other things that we're trying to do is working with landowners to promote best management practices as it relates to both land and water management. And again, working with these individuals to identify opportunities to improve water conditions or water use in the drainage. So if there are folks that are interested in discussing what we might be able to do to improve conditions for Yellowstone cutthroat trout in the Greybull River drainage, please reach out to me. So another thing that we're trying to do is reconnect populations. And sometimes it's difficult for individuals to wrap their minds around what this might entail. But one thing that we're trying to do is allow for upstream fish passage. Now, if you think about a trout stream, those things that a trout need to carry out their life cycle might not exist in the same locales. For example, you might have places where the fish might need to reproduce. Those spawning riffles might be in places that are far distant from the deep pools that a fish might need to exist over winter. Now, for a variety of reasons, we may have put barriers in, whether they are road culverts or irrigation diversion structures, or you name it. There are a number of ways in which humans have fragmented habitat for Yellowstone cutthroat trout. And one thing that you need to remember is the way fish move is linear. There has been a bunch of discussion about migration corridors as it relates to big game and ungulates. You have to remember that those animals a lot of times can move in two dimensions, whereas as fish, they need to stay in the water. So those barriers that exist can be pretty detrimental to those populations. So in order to reconnect, to allow for the upstream passage of those fish, there have been a number of projects. This is the Upper Sunshine Diversion. This was a project that was taken on and led by the folks at Trout Unlimited. It was a partnership with the Greybull Valley Irrigation District. This diversion structure was a near complete barrier to any upstream movement of Yellowstone cutthroat trout. We know that juvenile fish, there was no way that they were going to be able to pass upstream from the structure, and it was rare for even an adult fish to pass that upstream of that structure. Well, a project was completed with the new diversion structure that now integrated a fish ladder. This provides an opportunity for those fish to migrate upstream while water is being diverted for irrigation purposes. This allows for the upstream passage of fish at that structure. So there are a number of other places in which, and again, I should mention that many of these were Trout Unlimited led projects. The upper left-hand corner was a series of perched culverts on Timber Creek. The upper right-hand corner was a series of perched culverts on the Franks Fork. And then the lower picture was a perched culvert that was on upper Timber Creek. Now, if you look at the structures that went in to replace those, most of those have, or all of those structures have natural substrate bottoms and have allow for fish passage at those locales. Now, there's another portion to the reconnect as it relates to Yellowstone cutthroat trout, and that is reducing entrainment at points of diversion. Now, if you think about that schematic that I had of this hypothetical Yellowstone cutthroat stream, many of those barriers are irrigation diversion structures. And so if a fish moving downstream encounters one of those structures, there is the potential that those fish might end up going down the irrigation ditch instead of staying in the river. And we have evaluated a number of these places by putting traps in the ditch. These are entrainment nets where you can quantify the amount of fish that are coming down the irrigation the irrigation ditch. And when those structures that are in training or capturing many of these fish that are going downstream, if there's a substantial component of the population that's going down the ditch and might be lost to the population, we can go in and install, these are fish screens that allow for water to pass through, but they prevent fish from going down the ditch. Again, another Trout Unlimited project here on Timber Creek. This irrigation structure has there's a diversion here. The fish come in. The screen keeps the fish in the stream and routes them back to the stream, and water travels down the ditch fish free. For the restoring component, there are opportunities that we've used to work with landowners to improve habitat conditions for Yellowstone cutthroat trout. This again is a place we had some community involvement here, where we worked on a tributary to the Greybull to try to improve the riparian habitat by planting some woody vegetation. We're also working to restore Yellowstone cutthroat populations where we can. This is a tributary to the Greybull River. I believe this is Anderson Creek, where we expanded. There was a natural waterfall barrier, and we worked to expand Yellowstone cutthroat to available habitat upstream from that barrier. Now, with all of these projects, an important component is monitoring. So we'll monitor these populations a number of ways. We'll use radio telemetry, which includes surgically implanting fish with a device that allows us to track their movements. And we'll also, we can use a variety of methods to track those, whether it's by air or on the ground. Sometimes it even involved floating the river. We'll also use what are called passive integrated transponders, where you implant a very small microchip inside a fish. Now the fish have to pass by an antenna array in order to be detected, but this is a very good, if for example, this is on that Upper Sunshine Diversion project, we installed these radio frequency identifier readers on that fish ladder so that we could identify fish moving upstream through that fish ladder. Using radio telemetry, it helps us not only identify how successful some projects are, but identify other projects as well. This project was done in conjunction with the Upper Sunshine Diversion. Every one of those dots is a radio location tag, an individual location of a radio tagged fish. And while we focused on putting radio tags in the Greybull River and seeing the fish's response in relation to that Upper Sunshine Diversion, we had a number of fish that actually swam downstream and up the Wood River, and we found them immediately below the Lower Sunshine Diversion as well, which is also a barrier to upstream fish movement, and is a project that is in the making. Hopefully in the not too distant future, we'll actually have fish passage at that Lower Sunshine Diversion on the Wood River as well. Other way that we monitor projects is to conduct electrofishing in that upper left-hand corner. The lower picture there is a picture of one of those RFID antennas, and those fish that are inserted with microchips pass through those those antennas and can be detected. And the picture on the right there is Aaron Leonetti, our fish passage biologist, with that is a fluvial cutthroat. So it's a migratory fish that has moved up into a tributary on which we were removing diversion, some of those diversion structures. And it's good to see some of those large riverine fish that are actually making it into that small tributary. Now, I know that was the 10,000 foot view of many of the projects that we were working on the Greybull River drainage to help conserve Yellowstone cutthroat trout. And I wanted to leave plenty of time to answer any questions that folks out there might have.
We've got several. So is Game and Fish seeing any negative effects on the cutthroat trout habitat on the upper and middle Greybull due to cattle excrement?
You know, we don't have a whole lot of information as it relates to the effects of cattle and probably the E. coli that would be related to that. You know, those nutrient loading can be a concern in a number of places, but I would say that there are far greater threats to Yellowstone cutthroat trout than cattle grazing in those portions of the Greybull River.
What would those greater threats be?
Really, if we could figure out a way to have plenty of water for everyone, that would be terrific. There are some one of the greatest limiting factors to Yellowstone cutthroat in that portion of the middle and lower Greybull are really the low flows, primarily in the winter time.
How do the rocks in a river system affect the trout, whether it's limestone or granite, that kind of thing?
So the rocks in a stream can affect the water chemistry in a stream. For example, limestone has a tendency to have increase the pH of some water and can increase the amount of dissolved solids that are present in the water. And when you have limestone in a water, increasing those dissolved solids, it actually fuels the food chain in a way that increases the productivity and the productive capacity of that water. In the Absaroka volcanics that we have in the headwater of the drainage, this is true for a number of places that have granite as well. Those places those types of geology don't afford very much productivity to the water. And so, generally, streams flowing through limestone will have higher level of trout. Biologists like myself will, one of the things that we do is measure the amount of trout flesh that's in a stream, and we call that biomass. And the streams that flow through like limestone type substrates tend to have a higher biomass than do streams that have volcanic or granitic geologies.
We have a couple questions about the map on slide 7. There's a gap in the northwest corner of the map. Why is that? Like, there's no cutthroat.
Go back to slide 7 so I can refresh my memory as to which one it is. There's a gap in the
northwest corner.
The northwest corner of the in the northwest corner of that map, Actually, when you go in the Missouri River drainage, the fish that the cutthroat that are native to that portion of southwest Montana, for example, are west slope cutthroat trout. So I'm assuming that is the question. Mm-hmm. Where it says Montana, that is all that was historically west slope cutthroat trout country.
That feeds in perfectly to the next question, which is how in areas where there might be overlap between cutthroat species, how do you tell the difference between like a Yellowstone and the west slope or something like that?
So it's really difficult to knowing what drainage you're in is sometimes the best way to go about distinguishing which cutthroat species you're talking about. So like I said, in the Snake River drainage, in the Yellowstone, and in the Wind Bighorn, those are going to be Yellowstone cutthroat trout. In the Missouri River drainage, you're generally talking about west slope cutthroat trout. There are differences in spotting pattern between those different subspecies. West slope cutthroat trout, for example, most of the spots will be concentrated at the fleshy part of the tail called the caudal peduncle, whereas you'll have more, they're more spread out above the lateral line, which is the line that it's a sensory organ that fish use. But they're concentrated towards the tail as well as extended above the lateral line. We do have a different morphotype of Yellowstone cutthroat trout in the Snake River drainage above Palisades Reservoir that folks generally refer to as the Snake River cutthroat trout. Whether or not that is a unique subspecies is still debatable, but those fish actually have a fine peppering of spots across their flanks, whereas the Yellowstone cutthroat trout have larger spots, generally about the size of a pencil eraser.
Cool. And then can you expand about work with tribal governments and kind of what are they seeking and how does that relationship work?
The tribes that I've worked most closely with include the Wind River as well as the Crow Nation, and representatives from the Fish and Wildlife Service assist with the management of those the resources on those tribal lands. I'd be out of place to say that I've worked directly with with those tribes myself, but the Fish and Wildlife Service working with those tribes has helped. We have partnerships in which we will assist with reestablishing of native fish where it's possible on those tribal lands, but it's really the Fish and Wildlife Service working with those tribal councils.
Cool. How do the fish ladders work to allow fish upstream? Like, how are the fish navigating those?
So generally, to create a barrier to upstream fish movement, what you need to have is some sort of drop. Trout by their nature are actually pretty good jumpers, but if you have a drop that is greater than 3 feet high, you're going to eliminate fish moving upstream. What those fish ladders do is reduce the amount of drop that a fish has to jump in order to, so that fish ladder on the Upper Sunshine Diversion, for example, instead of having one large drop, has a series of small drops that allows the fish to gradually jump over those small drops in order to make it above that, what was a large drop prior.
Cool. How receptive are private landowners to protecting the cutthroat and best practices associated with that?
Generally, the landowners are very receptive especially in the Greybull River drainage. We have great working relationships with many of the large landowners. There are a few places where there are some hurdles that need to be overcome, and one is that, as I mentioned in my presentation, that non-native fish are the greatest threat to the long-term persistence of Yellowstone cutthroat. And so in order to maintain those Yellowstone cutthroat trout, many times what we have to do is remove those non-natives that will compete with or prey on our native Yellowstone cutthroat trout. And so generally we have great relationships with landowners as it relates to improving habitat and doing good things for cutthroat. But there are some landowners that do like some non-native trout. We don't have non-native trout widely distributed throughout the Greybull River drainage, but we do have some places in which we would really like to remove some of those non-natives, just to ensure that they don't spread and crowd out our native cutthroat in the future.
So how does the lower sunshine play into that? Because there's, like tiger trout and slake and.
Yeah, absolutely. And that was one of the things that I did fail to mention. So a few of the things that we've done in order to protect Yellowstone cutthroat trout is to restrict any kind of stocking of non-native fish. And as you mentioned, we do have some non-native fish. However, the fish that you mentioned are hybrid trout that are either sterile, so they're unable to reproduce, or they have very low reproductive potential. So tiger trout are a sterile hybrid between brown trout and brook trout. And we can strongly control their numbers by the numbers that we stock. Those reservoirs that we manage in the Greybull River drainage, we are only stocking fish that don't have the ability to impact our Yellowstone cutthroat trout. So splake have very limited reproductive potential, and if they were to escape from Lower Sunshine Reservoir, they wouldn't be able to reproduce and cause issues for our Yellowstone cutthroat in the Greybull River drainage itself. We do stock Yellowstone cutthroat in both Upper and Lower Sunshine Reservoirs, and so all of the fish species that we stock in the Greybull River drainage are either Yellowstone cutthroat or a sterile or a hybrid trout that is sterile or not reproductively viable. In addition, any stocking that occurs on private waters that are adjacent to the Greybull River drainage have to be approved by the Game and Fish Department, and we're only allowing those fish species that don't have the ability of impacting Yellowstone cutthroat trout within this drainage.
How frequently do you monitor the populations in person on, say, the Greybull or one of the reservoirs?
So the reservoirs we monitor on a 3-year rotation, and we conduct population estimates on streams in the Greybull River drainage, generally within a 10-year increment. Sometimes they're a little more, there's a little less time between those. We have 3 fisheries managers in the entire Bighorn River drainage, and so we have a lot of responsibilities. We don't get to be all the places we'd like to be all of the time, but the last population estimates that we conducted on the Greybull and Wood Rivers were in 2015.
Is Game and Fish considering expanding catch and release areas on heavily fished areas of the Shoshone River?
On the Shoshone River. That is probably another discussion. We're actually doing a pretty intensive survey of the North Fork Shoshone over the next number of years, looking at what angler exploitation is. So what proportion of that population that's actually harvested by anglers, and generally for implementation of a restriction that is of an angling regulation that's that restrictive, we would do so in an instance where it's where it would be biologically necessary, but we need to collect those data to see if that is indeed the case.
Awesome. I think that's the last of the questions that we have. I'm not seeing any more. So yeah, so thank you so much for joining us. I'm sure if there are questions we get, I will send them your way.
Okay. Yeah, I can be reached at the Cody Regional Office of the Wyoming Game and Fish Department. If anybody needs to get a hold of me, I can be reached at by calling the Cody Regional Office, or you can reach me at my email, which is my name, jason.burckhardt@yo.gov. I'll spell that last name because it's pretty difficult. It's BURCKHARDT. So jason.burckhardt@yo.gov.
Awesome. Thank you so much for being here. This was great.
All right. Thank you.
Thanks.